La vérité touche au réel.
Young Jacquians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia, Isabel Millar.
Engaging in conscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
Guys, we're back in Seminar 3, Psychosis.
Chapter 8, the symbolic sentence.
Yeah, the symbolic sentence, which is definitely, it was a very tricky chapter, just because a lot of stuff, it kind of goes over your head at first. You got to read it like at least I read it like 4 times, and I can't say that.
Yeah.
But
yeah, totally. I read it also like 3 or 4 times, and the last time I feel like I grasped something, because there's so much, it references so much, and you can go into so many rabbit holes, and it's hard to get like the bigger picture of what he's trying to say, at least for me.
You have to pay really careful attention to when he pivots from one topic to another, because like you can lose the context really quickly, and you're like, wait,
exactly,
why are we talking about this now?
Right.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I caught all those pivots, but yeah.
The shifts are crazy, and it's kind of like in Schreber's text itself. He mentions in the beginning, Schreber's case is Schreber's text, and I was rereading his book, right? And I noticed one specific passage where he again talks about the Cassiopeia in the Schreber text, and he like starts by saying, yeah, well, I have this thing where I have this like rays around my head, you know, like Jesus, and this blinds people when they see me, and sometimes it blinds them so much that, like, he mentions an instant where someone vanishes, and then he says this is just like the case where, and then he talks about something completely else and doesn't come back to the crown of rays around his head. And I feel like these kinds of shifts, it's the same in this chapter. We were like, okay, so it's related to this, and then no relation. It's like, wait, what?
Psychotic train of thought.
Right.
Totally, yeah.
Right. So I know I don't know if I volunteered or if I was voluntold to lead off the discussion, but you know, I came prepared. So I guess I'll start off with at least
Forced choice.
Forced choice. The forced choice. Well, I'm glad I took the forced choice, so I'm not psychotic, you know. But yeah, I'll take at least like 10 minutes to kind of go off like some topics that I found kind of interesting. And I want to start off with the beginning, in which as Lacan, again, the investigation of psychosis is contextualized through the memoirs of Schreber, but in this one, symbolic sentence, he's analyzing a text by a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, I believe, named Moritz Catan, or Caton, however you pronounce it. And he's really dubious of the way he uses the word defense. And defense has been something that he's mentioned a couple times that he's very avoidant of, just like regression, which is another term. And I think we've mentioned the term defense in Seminar 1, but looking at the old essays and studies of Freud from the days where he was working with Breuer on case studies of hysteria, like most of his stuff, he's trying to see all these psychopathologies and illnesses from historical standpoint, in which we could find a historical moment in this person's life in which there is a sufficient cause for the illness, tracing it back to a single event. Just like in the sense where he believed trauma or sexuality was focused on a specific event in the person's life via the seduction theory, rather than something structural and formal or constitutive of the subject itself. And the same thing with defense. He kind of is in that moment until he gets at defense hysteria. Now, defense hysteria was one of the three hysterias, neuroses that he was investigating with Breuer. And he noticed something in this, and this is the time where he is working with hypnosis. And that in these moments of defense hysteria, we get what's called a hypnoid state, in which it's very synonymous to a state of hypnosis. It's not sleeping, but the sort of symptoms and hallucinations and defenses come out, or which he'll call memory disturbances, that there's a relationship between disturbance and memory, but it is not an actual memory of something that literally happened back when like I was 2 or something like that. Rather, it's a sort of artificial reconstruction. And so this is where Lacan wants to show that what Freud gets at in his later years is to get away from a chronological view of looking at memory disturbances, looking at the neurosis and trauma, and rather as something topographical, right? And this is where, if we talk about defense for Schreber, it's nothing chronological, but rather it's something constitutive to his primary libidinal investment to cope with psychosis, and that's narcissism. And this is why he's continuously stressing on looking at narcissism, because what narcissism is it is structural for Lacan, but we should think of libido as trying to structure itself. So if we call it a defense, well, narcissism is a defense of sort of lack and a lack of bodily instincts. So we have a first identification with the fragmented body. But for a psychotic, there's no primary narcissism where they have an ego or ideal ego or ego ideal. What we have is, like we've said before, the foreclosure of the signifier. And so the fragmented body of the narcissism redoubles itself in this imaginary alienation or verbal alienation, verbal hallucinations, that this defense is not only structural to Schreber's narcissism, but defense is the structure of the ego itself. Our ego is a defense in the form of fantasies and all these other sorts of symptoms that aim at defending and resisting the unconscious manifesting itself. And so this is where Lacan wants to at least clarify a few things before we continue on. And in this symbolic sentence, he wants to talk about many things with the symbolic order and its relationship to Schreber, but also the distinction between, again, psychosis and neurosis, and even our sense of reality. And I like the part of his evocation of deja vu. It's like everything that we have in reality, if we call it reality, is symbolic reality. Everything that we experience, whether or not we want to shut our consciousness away from certain things, is already a modulation and articulation of the symbolic reality in the unconscious. The symbolic is already articulating itself even when we least expect it. And so he talks about deja vu and the experience of it being similar to what psychoanalysis is investigating, give or take, but that you have at one moment this feeling that like, oh, I felt like I've been here before. But what you have is a sort of recounting of a modulation that was prior, but it's not like it is the same as something that happened in the past, but rather it can only have ground as an unreality based upon the articulation of the reality that we already live in. And so what we need to do to understand it is to understand how the symbolic itself situates us via the signifier, in that these moments of deja vu are rather just the way that the signifier, which we can construct with memory, manifests itself in a sort of all too familiar but inverted form. And what does that have to do with Schreber? Well, I think it doesn't really have to do anything with Schreber insofar as like it has any relation to psychosis, but that even when we talk about these instances like deja vu, which psychology, he says, has been investigated in, we should see we shouldn't see it as a sort of fetishism of a certain event that happens. Is it really real? You know, what does deja vu come from? Is it something in part of the brain? Rather, something that maybe is coincidental, but can at least be relayed to in the modulation of signifiers, in the modulation of in articulation of the symbolic order, because we're dealing with a signifier that's always in a differential network. This is how we have metaphor. But I don't think Schreber has something like deja vu, or could at least account for it like that. Everything is immediate for him because he doesn't have the time aspect that the signifier has, a temporalized construction of time, which builds upon comprehension and conclusion and a discourse. So I'll leave it right there.
Yeah, like what I would.
Nice, a lot of. Go ahead.
That was a great summary, but the biggest question I had is, like, to me, this whole temporal aspect is super interesting in this chapter, right? And I feel like what I took away from it was that he was saying that what is different for Schreber is that this symbolic sentence, or this existence of the symbolic as a structuring aspect of reality, as a kind of constant talking of a constant chain of signifiers.
Yeah.
It's for him, it exists, right? But it's not internalized.
Yeah.
It is outside.
Yeah.
And this is the voice that talks to him from the outside, right?
Right. Because this is the verbal alienation that he mentioned. Yeah. It's like he mentions, it's like, what's the difference between the subject or Schreber, the psychotic, and the subject in the writing? Who's the speaker, Schreber, and also who is the one who writes? There are two different types of sort of alienations that we have to grapple with. It seems like, from the Schreber that's being investigated in these cases versus the Schreber of the memoirs.
Well, something that really struck me was how alienation is retained for both the psychotic and the neurotic in one way or another. It's like Schreber is alienated by the pronouncements and like dicta that come from God himself. He can't really interpret them, and they're very self-referential, or they're cut off, or they're suspended, or they're scanned in terms of like a scansion. There are these intervals. They're, like you were saying, there's these temporal aspects to them, but he suffers the temporality of the signifier in a way that the ego, for the neurotic, in a sense, defends us from having to experience firsthand. We don't have this immediate experience of all the different mechanisms of the unconscious, which, as Lacan put it, puts it like, basically govern our actions as, I think he says, spoken actions. Right. So it's like, you know how they say the psychotic is spoken? Well, so is the neurotic in a sense, but we can avail ourselves of the alienation that is provided to us through the ego, through this kind of cognitive mapping of ourselves into our environment, into our Umwelt, right? In a way that does not force us to experience firsthand in an imaginary form all of these mechanisms that form a kind of interplay that determines the subject. But for Schreber, he is indeterminable. Ultimately, like, I like what you were saying, Andrew, about who is Schreber the speaker, who is Schreber the figure who is temporarily messianic and has rays of light coming out of his head. And that doesn't seem to concern Schreber so much as the message itself, the fundamental language, which he is receiving, which is for him, which seems to give directions, but in an incredibly cryptic manner and an interrupted manner.
And I think that's why before, in the chapter before, he said something like, Schreber shows us the truth of the unconscious, like straightforwardly, in the sense that this whole constant talking that as neurotics we don't hear as a real vocal thing is for Schreber completely externalized, right?
Right.
And like he hears it as something from the outside, because I like this part in the third section where Lacan says, as if we don't, all of us, all the time have visions, right?
Yeah.
As if we are never in the grip of phrases that just pop into our heads, sometimes brilliant, illuminating phrases that orientate us, right? It's like we have that constant inner talking, or this symbolic kind of language articulation, or the structuring of our actions as spoken is also there for neurotics. But for psychotics, it's coming from the outside, or it's a vocal phenomenon. And I also really liked where he said that it's a very unimportant question to ask if the psychotic hears the things, or how loud does he hear the things, or is it really a hearing? Because that's not important. And then he criticizes this kind of sense of reality, or a philosophical idea of reality as a sensible thing, right? That's not important. And then really mysteriously he says it's not important that they hear it, it's more important how they react to it, which I also
right. I was just thinking, because I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking, well, how often do we hallucinate things and not even realize it? Sometimes we realize it. You see a plastic bag on the street and think it's a black cat or something, and you're like, oh, I thought I saw a cat. You know, suddenly you have to sort of recalibrate everything in your purview, to make sure, oh, okay, am I here? Is that there? The difference is, I think in neurosis, you have that moment of, oh, I thought I saw this thing.
Yeah.
Even if Schreber is able to acknowledge that something is a hallucination, which I think Lacan says he's able to acknowledge that certain things are hallucinations, it's not so much the fact that he experiences hallucinations. The Wolfman experiences an hallucination. He's not a psychotic, technically. People can have psychotic breakdowns and not be psychotic, but it's the idea who's experiencing the hallucination, and is this a message for me?
Right, exactly. And like, you know, you could also have like a double take, like when you're out in public where you think like you see somebody that looks like a friend or something, and you look back like, oh, that's not the same person, right? You know, or like, and I think in that instance of talking about the Wolfman, it's in recounting the hallucination, or like this moment, it's when you say, oh, I think I hallucinated, or I had a hallucination, it's also in the sense that, like, do you have the ability to you know, signify the ego with an I? You know, as we talked about in seminar 2, is like the I is an other, the ego is an other. And I think this is where we have a distinction with the neurotic and the psychotic, is that, well, most of it rests in this formulation of an ego ideal. It's not who I am now, but who I hope to be for the other, right?
Or the thing they don't have is doubt in that sense.
Doubt too, doubt. And it's
this distance to their ego.
Yeah, because the neurotic will always
something, and it's like, oh yeah, it's that what I see. It's not that I doubt it again. Like they see the plastic bag as a cat, and they don't doubt, wait, is that a cat? Right.
You know, and like to kind of like trivialize it for a bit, like, you know, with a neurotic or an everyday ordinary neurotic, it's like maybe they like were like, you know, working at like a, I don't know, Amazon warehouse is the only thing I can think of. Is like, and then they finally get up to like the sort of managerial high position, and then like they're getting all this like feedback, oh, you're such a great like leader, and they have this like, am I though? Like, what do they mean by that? You know, this like sort of doubt of like, am I really the person that they say I am? I can't see myself, you know, I want to see myself like this, but I can't, like, it's hard for me, like this, you know, people will call it, oh, that's like imposter syndrome, but no, I think that's this constituent for the fact that you could never be the thing that you want to be. And even if you try to strive so hard to achieve a symbolic identity or symbolic role, whether it's like a teacher, lawyer, doctor, like in like in its idealized form, libidinal form, it's like when you get it, it's already a subverted or inversion of itself based upon its imaginarized. It's like it's not even just the symbolic identity, but the fact that the symbolic identity, its register, becomes inverted and redoubled because of its imaginarized form via the ego. And this is where we have this interplay between imaginary and symbolic, right? It's not just the symbolized image, but the imaginarized symbol as well.
It's like,
I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, is that kind of doubting split, is that the split between ego ideal and ideal ego?
I would say, like, so far as like the ego ideal is never really constitutively whole, right? It does rely on, you know, the symbolic, and it's like it's never a complete thing. So yeah, I think there's always this split between the two, because what and I don't know if it's doubt necessarily, but how Chiesa says it in Subjectivity and Otherness is that the striving for the ego ideal and its libidinal investment retroactively constructs the form of it, or the form and structure of it, which is ideal ego. So we should think of ideal ego as the sort of container and form, and the content is the ego ideal. And I think, maybe it's like doubt, but also this impossibility to get it, because it does rely on the other.
Because you view yourself from that perspective of perfection somehow.
Yeah, and trying to get at that virtual third gaze of what an ego ideal is, or an ideal thing is.
To break it down a little bit, it's sort of like, if we're going to bring it back to the mirror stage, this ideal ego is the mirror image, which seems to have this sort of wholeness, this cohesion, all of the parts fit together, and it moves with more fluidity and animation than you feel yourself capable of. You want to adopt that position. You want to, in some sense, consume that image, make it your own. That's the ideal of self-containment that we get. And then with the advent of the symbolic, and the no of the Father, the phallic function, it's like you can only reattain this imaginary wholeness via the symbolic, via achievement, status, how other people regard you. But of course, the issue is, because that initial image was already an inversion, what we get is an inversion of the inversion. So to bring it back to the kind of experience of imposter syndrome, as Andrew as it's popularly known, it's like, well, that just sort of being told, hey, you're great at what you do. You are a real doctor, teacher, firefighter, scientist, whatever. Even if you've been dreaming of becoming this thing your entire life, taking a page out of Zizek's book, for they know not what they do, you experience a sort of the inversion of the inversion. So Andrew's talking about this container, which would be the ideal ego, right? This a moment that never really was, but this originary moment of one-to-one, this asymmetry between the body and the image. It's like you see, I think it's almost like the experience of, oh, it was inverted to begin with.
Yep.
So the symbolic is an illusory reattainment of something that's a kind of illusion to begin with. But because Schreber, he doesn't have the symbolic, he only has a kind of a temporary, like endlessly provisional sort of semblance of the symbolic that's kind of held together by these neologisms. He doesn't really feel like a fraud. He doesn't feel fake. He doesn't doubt. He doesn't feel like that he's, seeing something that's not there,
Right. Isn't it also interesting?
So sure about that he's so attractive to attract, right? He's so sure about it. Like there's one section where he says the sun was supposed to be in a different universe to somehow stabilize, and not a different universe, different galaxy, or right, to somehow stabilize this other galaxy. But he says he's so attracting to the rays of the sun that the sun had to stay there. And then for a specific period, there were two suns because there had been a replacement sun for the Earth. So he's absolutely sure that he is so attractive to anything. And I mean, I just want to give one movie example of neurotic. which is like the beginning of Annie Hall, right? The most neurotic movie ever, right? In the beginning, there's like Woody Allen's character, and he's like interpreting some double meaning into what someone else said to him, and he's thinking that this other person is like anti-Semitic towards him, right? But he's giving a really complex interpretation. So he's kind of like absolutely operating in the realm of doubt, of double meanings, right? And Schreber would never do that. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
what would you say, Andrew?
No, I agree with that. Well, I'm also thinking of like, I don't know if this ties in, but that episode of Seinfeld where it's like, he's like on that, he had just finished that date with that girl and she's like, you want to come up for coffee? And he's like, no, thank you. It's too late. But it doesn't really mean coffee. It's like, it's this innuendo for you want to come up and it would eventually lead to sex. You never say, I want to have sex. You always, it's always inverted with something else, hey, you want to go for coffee, but he doesn't get it. He's like, no, thank you. It's too late. And then like Jerry's just like, why did you go up? She said she wanted to go out for coffee. Coffee doesn't mean you actually have coffee. It means sex, But like, I think like, ultimately, I think he would still be a neurotic. It's not like he missed the memo and he's just like, psychotic or something, but like he was just far too late. But like the way in which like, the signifier for the neurotic though doesn't pop up in its immediacy, but always comes up in a sort of inverted form in repression, right? A certain signifier that it's always substituting and replacing it for another one, but the S1 is quilted into it. It just shows up in an inverted form, and especially in a dream, like any sort of symbol or theme. But for Schreber, it's like everything appears too real in the form of a delusion because it's just on an imaginarized investment. And I always found this, I think he says it in here, this thing that's interesting about his relationship with God is that he knows that God wants him and only him and communicates to him and only him through this nerve contact. Yeah. But the one thing he says, I just know that God is far, far away, right? So it's like, he can never get too close to God. Because I think it's like in the last chapter, was it like, I think the last chapter where he got too close and what did he call him? Wretch or whatever?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It takes him back.
It's very strange.
The way language for him becomes imaginarized is really fascinating because I think it's easy to miss certain dimensions of it because you could be just so sort of like bamboozled and confused by like the images that he hallucinates, but at the same time it's sort of, what does Lacan say about God being very far away for Schreber? He says God isn't who is, God is who is very far away. So it's almost this question of, we were talking about like a few seminars ago, seminar 1, the Verneinung essay, we have these like sort of judgments of existence.
Yeah, the judgment of attribution.
So I think for Schreber, what we get are different shifting modes of existence at all time, and that's what's really baffling about his own delusions, because it's like, what does Lacan say, or what does he warn us against doing? Remaining at the imaginary level, thinking that a good psychoanalyst is someone who can follow the thread of someone's delusions
and gets you and understands
at the imaginary point.
Yeah.
And that okay, I get what has taken hold here erroneously in the psyche of this patient, and it needs to be corrected. They need to be disabused of this, the main hub of this psychotic experience of themselves, be restored to a kind of wholeness or whatever. But it's like, no, but if you look at the language that's articulated in his experience of God, in his relationship with God, with the rays, the way the rays speak, he says the rays themselves are psychologists. they represent these internal, what for the neurotic is an internal mechanism to the degree that it's repressed, for him laid bare. And what we get are, like I was saying before, sentences that are cut off. And what we get is another kind of cohesion, though, in these intervals, in these suspended motions of different articulations, and also in sort of what might appear in literary language to be sort of poetic devices almost, even though he's not a poet. We get all of these different mechanisms which are very characteristic of the unconscious as it reveals itself in the session
Right.
with a quote unquote normal neurotic. Structurally, there's a lot of, there are many resemblances here, and that's what's so interesting. And I think that's what he's trying to say, and especially what you were saying before, Andrew, about like how the ego is a form of defense to begin with. So yeah,
and then like even in like the defense and in the symptoms that arise, like it's the letter in its movement, that in its filtration that pops up in this moment, becomes a signifier. It gains some type of content, and this is not, we don't have this in Schreber, because all these neologisms are just fragmented but have no relation to one another, right? Because it's not that he doesn't have language when he speaks, he's speaking, but it's not quilted together. It's not part of a differential set of signifiers, with a universal equivalent, the master signifier. That's what's foreclosed to have any sort of discourse to begin with, because there's no discourse for him. Because remember, like what Lacan says in Seminar 1 about the elephant, right? It's that the signifier could be present within the thing's absence, right? We could have the elephant. We don't have to have the elephant here in the Zoom chat to talk about, the rights, what type of species, or like, if it's endangered, poaching, etc. That this signifier becomes present and then absent. But what it does, though, is allows the thing to die, but also the thing that it signifies, its object, to die while still taking the place of the thing. And that's what the signifier does. The event of the trauma that constitutes the subject then gets replaced with the signifier. And this is why there's a relationship between ES in the schema L with the movement of the signifier, because it takes the place of that. And through this, I used the term earlier, filtration, as it's moving through these different sessions, this filtration or inversion or redoubling shows how the ways that, even though signifiers manifest in different ways, new signifiers happen in each session, new signifiers come out in the dream, they can ultimately retroactively come back to the movement of one signifier that is the unary trait. And that's what brings meaning together. I about it in the sidelines with Zizek's example of quilting point, which I believe is foreshadowed into, we're going to be talking about this in the later lectures, but it's being foreshadowed with the difference between the neurotic and the signifier and these fragmentations of neologisms, is that you have what Zizek says in For They Know Not What to Do. You have the fear of dying, the fear of falling, the fear of getting sick, the fear of economic collapse. But what does it have to do, with anything, all these different fears? But the one thing that quilts it all together is the fear of God, or in like, ideology for, the Nazis, it was the Jews. So we have anti-Semitic ideology quilting all the fears that the average German citizen was facing each day. And they could, now say, oh, the Jew is the thing that we fear. And you all talk about like Pokemon Go. It's like, these virtual things that kind of quilts reality together to be both afraid of and desirable. And so that's the one thing that was.
But I mean, what you were saying is kind of going into the direction of the temporal.
Yeah.
But before we go there, I just want to add one more thing that I think was very important in this chapter. And what I would stress as like the difference between psychotic and neurotic. I mean, I wouldn't stress it. I mean, Lacan stresses it all the time, that like the repression of the neurotic is in loco, right?
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
repression of the psychotic is in altero, right?
Yeah. No,
That's what
that's
he
a
says.
good point. That's a good point.
And so it's like, I think like what I gained from this chapter was that
Mhm.
the psychotic, they still have discourse. It's just not, it's just outside. So Verwerfung doesn't mean that it completely vanishes or something like
Yeah.
that.
No, and
It's
that's the thing, because like they could have meaning, right? It's all
it's just not in their body. It's kind of like
Right.
castration doesn't
Right,
enter their
yes.
body, right?
right.
So it's happening, all the stuff is happening outside.
Mhm.
And I just want to mention one of the Freud texts, which was the further remarks on the neuropsychotics of defense.
Mhm.
And there he had a great example. And Lacan is right. Like Lacan says, Freud is so great with these prefigurations. And it's really incredible because
Right.
basically Freud says everything about psychotics that's important
Mhm.
here also.
Right.
Because there's this one example, which is really fun, where there's this woman and she reads a novel or a poem, and this poem reminds her of something sexual related to her husband, and she wants to repress that. So she's beginning to hear this poem being recited from voices from the outside, you know? So she doesn't repress it in herself somehow, but it's happening outside, and she thinks other people are reciting this poem to her or reciting specific passages from this poem, and then she thinks it's kind of like gossip happening because this poem is about a disgraced woman and so on. And that was fascinating. And he contrasts that in the other text, which is just neuropsychosis of defense, with the Abwehrhysterie, right? Defense hysteria, which is basically the repression is happening in loco, so in the symbol,
Yeah.
displacement, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And
But
there's
that's
great example. I just want to tell this one story, okay? There's this great, I love the case stories from Freud. I can't get enough of it. Like every time I read one, I'm like, I'm amazing. I want to teach series just with these, you know? Because there's one story where there's this woman and she saw a man in a theater play and she was like sexually aroused by this guy. But at the same time, this arousal came together with her having to go pee, right? So now she's constantly afraid of having to go to pee, and she always needs to be close to a toilet, right? So the fear of the sexual is like just being displaced to another thing.
Yeah.
And that's like, it's happening in the symbolic. It's not like putting what is repressed into the imaginary, in the sense that the imaginary is like the experience of the world.
Yeah.
And I thought like this is just what he stresses in this chapter.
Right.
That's a really good point, because it's like, he says whether it's conversion disorder or displacement, although in that essay, Neuropsychoses of Defense, I think he says that conversion disorder is actually much more efficacious in this regard. You're right. It's like it all takes place within the matrix of the symbolic. And we have these different signifying systems which overlap and we take to be in loco. As
Yeah.
I like that idea of in loco, because it's like, well, what is altero? Altero is Latin for like other, right? Outside, otherness, the big other.
Yeah.
But the big other doesn't really exist for the psychotic. So they need to have imaginarized, imagistic, hallucinatory experiences of what, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, they cannot confront directly. What the neurotic cannot confront, what Freud in that essay calls like an incompatible idea, is more so ignored.
Yeah.
And they are able to avail themselves of the symbolic order to ignore it, because displacement, although it never really works, it always fails ultimately, it leads to all sorts of consequences, is available to them.
Right.
They can depend on these signifying systems. And what do they offer but a kind of like a sense of context? And the thought that what I'm saying right now means anything ultimately depends on there being a locus or of meaning, a battery of signifiers which exists outside of me. And there's a kind of pact, right? That's where the symbolic pact comes in, where it's like we are all in agreement that even if we fail to say what we want to say, it could be said by someone somewhere, and that the words are there somewhere else. That's not an issue that for psychotic, and hence the certainty of like what's being articulated, whether in hallucinations, verbal, visual, whatever, is being articulated the way it is meant to. But then again, Schreber also experiences dead souls, right?
Yeah.
He also has to do with these dead souls, and also a language which is for him kind of empty at the same time. So he is in his own way also able to represent the void, empty dimension of language too, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if that gets us off course, but
No, definitely. I think like with repression too, like I think we've all beat with a dead horse. It's like it's or beat, what is it? Beaten to like a dead horse. It's that repression is not like we store things away into this like
Absolutely,
dungeon or whatever, like this like basement, this cauldron of id instincts and impulses, that it functions in what you two just said. Displacement is one, condensation is the other. And though Verneinung is not repression, Verneinung is the sort of symbolic articulation of what is repressed, but in a negative form, in the way that you could become conscious of what is repressed and still can't integrate it within your symbolic structure. It comes up in a negative form. The whole thing, it is not my mother. Oh, I can't give you I'm sorry, we don't have coffee with cream. I can't give you that. We have milk, so I can give you coffee without milk. That it's this negativity is already sort of inscribed, that this lack, which is being repressed, is already sort of inscribed and positively charged in its movement. The psychotic doesn't have that, and so that's why, like, when we talk about the return of the repressed for the neurotics, it comes up in this form. This substitution of these different signifiers is via displacement, condensation, or in these verbal articulations like Verneinung. And even like for the Wolfman, the Verneinung was happening in this hallucinatory manner, in which it was a hallucination, but there is something that returns in that form of real, of not a verbal hallucination, but something that could, when recounting, build off of signifiers, if that makes sense. And like I always think of, like, again, like the example, I think this would be an example of displacement in Sopranos with Tony Soprano, when he finally, like, I think he has like his last, like, or his most like punctual panic attack, and he blacks out, and somehow the gabagool is always being eaten around that time, and so it retroactively traces back to the moment where he was with his dad. He's doing a business exchange, and he's told to like wait in the back, and he ends up intruding on a horrific moment of his father trying to collect money that is owed to him by the butcher, and he ends up cutting his finger off. But it's not even that. He gets yelled at, and then when he goes back home with his dad, he sees, the dad like celebrating with the mom, and the mom, like, is putting her finger in his mouth all sexually as he eats the meat that he collected after cutting the butcher's finger, and then he drops, in a panic attack. So it's like that moment gets displaced onto the signifier of gabagool. And so, like, right there, I think is a perfect example of like how we see this happen in neurotic symptoms. This like, it was replaced on the gabagool, but that's not enough. It doesn't reveal itself in that immediacy, but in the inverted form, just so contingently, of the connection between that, the consuming of it, and blacking out, that the repressed returns.
Yeah, I think I just I want to come back to that, but before that, I just wanted to contest what you were saying, Nick, about altero, because I think it still works as other, but it's just a little other. I think there's a kind of displacement in psychosis. It's just you displace what you want to repress into a little other, kind of. You create a little other because you put it into the realm of the sensible, in the imaginary realm. So you create a little other, and that's kind of God, right? For sure, it's like a little other, but then it's also the displacement into a different register. So the other as a other register, right?
Right.
Whereas, I mean, it's so fascinating whereas neurotic repression, it's just like you move something over. It's like a logical operation for you, where you move an affect, so kind of a signification or something, over to a different signifier.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's just a displacement.
Yeah. That's the whole
that
movement
requires that everything is already symbolized, like your body is symbolized, all the objects are symbolized, because if not, they couldn't have this other meaning, like coffee then means sex, right?
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
if I could just break in here, because no, I don't disagree with you. It's kind of like there is this mythical moment of a primary symbolization, which is the Beiyang, right? Am I saying that right? It's like that is this mythical moment of this primary symbolization, let's say, in which a kind of social pact came about. I like the example that Sam McCormick uses in his talk about this, where he's sort of like, if you have a roommate who isn't doing the dishes, it's not exactly, at least in most social contexts, allowed, permitted to, smack that person upside the head because they left some dishes in the sink. You have a discussion about it, and that you assume the other person understands that this is the context for how one is supposed to behave in this situation. There's a contract in place almost, but not one that was ever really explicitly agreed upon. It wasn't like, hey, if we ever have a problem, let's make sure that we don't kill each other. Like, that's already assumed. That's part of like this primary symbolization. And that is, when we think about the big other, and that's what I meant by them, the psychotic not having any kind of apprehension of the big other, is that there is neither this locus of the law nor this locus of language, which for the neurotic is the same place. That is the loco. That's what I mean. But you're totally right. It's kind of like there's this multiplicity of little others that become almost if there was a displacement for the psychotic, it would be in the form of this production of little others. I would say,
and it
because
also,
they don't have all of these different overlapping contexts of symbolic systems to rely on to displace and condense.
Right. And isn't it interesting though, when we look at now Schreber and compared to like, the neurotic with Schreber's delusions and his relationship to God, it's always fine that God talks to him through nerve contact and that God is just so far, far away. But the one time he gets close to him, he has to kind of do something that resembles the stickleback, right? In the term, was it, what does he say? Wretch or whatever? I always forget, but it's like wretch. But it's like,
they use the English word. I never heard that.
And so like, what is God to
Luda, right?
Yeah, what is God to Schreber then in this mode? Because doesn't he represent then an imaginarized form of what could be the threat of castration if he gets too close to him? Because, well, if everything are imaginary others, like, God's an imaginary little other, but yet he has so much significance to him that, he's, God's lover, God loves him and only him. But the moment that he gets close, he gets that word and has to back away, because that just seems like a sort of threat, because the erotic investment in his secondary narcissism is not just a sort of sexualized eroticism, but it's also an aggressivity. And so it seems like where we get is this, where the two intercede, where it seems almost like a threat of castration, to where he would get locked into meaning, you know?
Isn't the threat also, though, his complete dissolution? Because despite the fact that he doesn't have the same kind of ego that we find in neurosis, he has a functioning mode of defense that does keep his world semi-intact. He can't operate in society like we can, but there is an intactness to his world, but it's extremely precarious because the other symbolic systems that we have in place, which I'm saying we rely on in primary symbolization, for example, don't exist for him. But there's still the threat, like you're saying, of ultimate castration. And it makes me think of something I read recently in Subjectivity and Otherness, where Chiesa seems to think he's put his finger on a kind of impasse in early Lacan, where it's like, would the full reintegration of the unconscious experience of the subject, the historicized present, wouldn't that also mean being fully dissolved into the symbolic qua the unconscious, and being, in simple terms, like utterly robbed of your subjectivity, of your, being in the world, not Dasein necessarily, but like of your sense of your own individuation within the world. And it seems like for Schreber, who seems, we might think as a psychotic is far gone, that threat still presents itself. And I think it's in the form of, right, like you're saying, with the imaginary, the real is only held at bay very tenuously for Schreber, who has to endlessly construct and reconstruct something like a stand-in for the symbolic system, so he isn't completely, swallowed whole by God, which isn't the unconscious for him, because he doesn't really have an unconscious, but the real.
Absolutely. That's a good point.
I think with this we are going back to the chapter before, because we already talked about that it's kind of, he has to sustain his reality by being in an imaginary relationship with God, which has the imaginary dialectic of, well, if he gets too close, he eats me, right? I vanish completely in complete identity, right? But if he's too distant, reality also vanishes, right? So his task is he has to, because it's very ambiguous, like feminization, in the beginning it's negative, then it becomes kind of positive, but it all relates to him being necessary to like hold the world in a state of existence only by him like seducing God, right? And there's this one sentence which was, it is suggestive to see how this network, which is symbolic by nature and maintains the image in a degree of stability in interhuman relationships, is necessary so that everything doesn't suddenly reduce to nothing, right? And then he says like that the veil is torn away and everything vanishes in complete yawning blackness, like this Lacan. And from the last chapter, and I think it's just what he's trying to say is, because the symbolic is outside as a sensible kind of thing, he has to sexually seduce it to keep it there so the world doesn't vanish. So that's what's happening, right? But the problem in this seduction, right, is that there's the dialectic of the imaginary, and this exact dialectic is completely expressed in the signifier luda, because it's aggressive but also sexualizing. It's destroying, but also sexualizing. But that's the last chapter. I mean, I'm wondering in this chapter why he brings up time. And I don't get why he says, so in chapter 8, there's the sentence, as you mentioned, Andrew, which is like about, it's not about restoring a piece of lost time in a chronological time, but it is on a topographical level.
Yeah. And
What do
so
you guys think does
what
he
that
mean
has
by
to do
topographical?
is like, well, when you think of like the topographical level, it's the way that the signifiers through a pressurized time discourse can structure, you know, the subject, can structure the subject's truth. As we're working in the early seminars for psychoanalysis and Lacan, it's in seminar one, it's the restitution of the subject's history, but not the subject's history in the past, but the past insofar as that it's lived in the present. And in seminar two, we compare it to the Meno, in which it is a truth that always is going to be, like, you know, remembered, right? What's the Platonic term, reminiscence or whatever? But not a sort of truth of the Platonic forms, or rather something that is resuscitated from, you know, the unconscious into a punctual truth, and with Lacan's recreational mathematics, truth effects. So something that within a pressurized time of repetition and contingency creates a truth effect of the subject. So I think that's the thing too, that like I forget what chapter it was in this book, when he talks about like the three registers in terms of speech, he says real speech is the diachronic aspect of it, in which it's like, it's not so much that you have a signifier, but the signifier can combine and create a discourse, and that is time. And I always, you know, thinking about it, I go back to the example that Leon Brenner gives us in our talk with him, of the look out for your teammate, but, you know, he breaks it down simply like look out, look out for your, look out for your team, look out for your teammate. So like the movement creates a sort of pressurized time in which a discourse is made and retroactively goes back to the subject of the statement.
Yeah, what I
Yeah.
also got from that was kind of like this entire seminar, I don't think he's delivering it, conducting it just for the end of explaining psychosis to people, but also setting in relief better neurosis, but also the three registers. And what he wants to combat is any sort of impulse to reconstruct the continuity, to reconstitute the continuity of one's lived experience without gaps, without holes, almost like in a cinematic way. And what is he says duration, right? He
Yeah.
quotes
Bergson.
Bergson's concept of
Yeah.
duration there. He says that's not what we're going for. And if you tried to do that with Schreber's delusions, good luck, because you're not going to find a coherent timeline. It's like you were saying earlier, Max, it's like he abandons his Jesus rays like that. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about the continuity of it, even though he's very much concerned with like lineage and things like that, but he's not concerned with the kind of imaginary continuity that many people, when they enter into psychoanalysis or just any kind of psychotherapy in general, think that recounting their every detail of their entire lives is going to leave no stone unturned, and then I'm going to find out exactly who I am.
I mean,
That's
just
not
to
what
add
we're
to
going
that,
for.
before you
Yeah.
continue, like, you also have to remember that he's writing his text in retrospective, right? I mean, that
Good
would be
point.
a
Yeah.
perfect chance to write like make it a continuous story that's consistent. But you read it and it shifts and turns, and in the end, the delusion is something completely different. But he doesn't seem to notice. Like he just starts,
Yeah, right.
and everything seems to make sense to him, right? He
He's like
starts
Trump
saying,
in that way.
that chick
You
wants
know?
to rape me, and in the end, like, I'm the wife of God. Like that's how the thing develops. But to him, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's like listening to Trump, basically. You know how Trump starts at one thing and ends up with windmills? It's just like,
Yeah.
how did you get there? And there's a seductive quality to it. I mean, I think people are fascinated by, not saying Trump's necessarily psychotic, but that kind of discourse is like,
Yeah,
incredibly
just
seductive. But he wants to focus on the topographical level, and I think another metaphor we could produce here or adduce is the one of because I was listening to Becker earlier when he was talking about um uh it's 7R1 stereoscopy, I think is how you say it. It's
yeah.
like that
The
device
stereography.
that the stereoscopic sort
Yeah.
of thing that before people had, actual fun entertainment, they would look through this thing and see like two images that are slightly different, and the slight difference creates this sensation that's kind of fun and titillating, and it's like uh it's akin to parallax. Well,
Yeah.
I think in topographical, it's like what Lacan is saying is you have to not just focus on the symbolic, not just focus on the imaginary, but the parallax between the two, constantly modulating, and that's, let's say, where the real of one's lived historicized experience emerges, and that is also topographical,
Yeah.
right? And maybe Andrew could do a
No,
better job.
no, that's the
But
perfect.
yeah,
Yeah, the stereoscope. I forgot you mentions that, but Lacan mentions that in Seminar 1 too. No, and I think that that's perfect because and I think without that, you don't when you don't have the symbolic order, you don't have the position for that because it's not so much that you just have the parallax that rests in between as the sort of minimal difference between the symbolic order and the imaginary order, but it's the fact that you're symbolically situated in a position that allows for that minimal difference to be possible. And so your subjectivity has a real component to it because of that allows you to lay in between. But the difference is that we are so invested into a certain part that it goes misrecognized and alienated.
But I mean, like, what do you make of choosing this specific word? Because if I read topographical, I'm immediately thinking of the topographical model of Freud.
No, that's exactly what we're getting at too. It's just the fact that Lacan doesn't stay necessarily with the topography of
Yeah.
The interpretation of dreams, where he's got like that one mnemic model and with perception, and that's how the dream filters through, or really the traditional ego, it's super ego thing, but rather he sticks with a more structural way to apply these methods and especially with the dream one. This is where he comes up with the optical schema to provide not only a way in which we could see the birth of the imaginary, but also how the imaginary kind of redoubles itself with the structures of the dream because we have the signifiers play out and create alter egos. Just because you have a dream about your friend, it doesn't mean that's actually your friend. It's actually your ego invested into an inversion of itself via your friend or your mother, etc. We get at the real and antagonism of the dream where you can't account for yourself. The example is Irma's injection. Lacan's interpretation is that the real and the subject of Freud is in the throat of Irma, in which he can't account for himself. And that's an example of how we see the antagonism or the real of Freud. But that's a way to see topographically how the imaginary process of the ego formulates. And I mean, I would say like when we look at another example like schema L, that's another way in which we see the interplay between empty speech and full speech, but also the way the letter moves between ego, little other, and big other, right? I don't know if that answered your question or if it was helpful, but I think that's like to counteract between Freud's topographical and Lacan's. But I ultimately think that it's in essence or in principle the same thing, just with different models. He's getting at something that's more structural than chronological, right?
Oh, okay, yeah. Because my question was like, how does it relate then to the temporal aspect? Because I mean, you're kind of saying it's not about a chronological localization of events, as he says, but it's more about an interaction between these different registers, and then that in that sense it's topographical because
yeah, and how the event gets captured in them, and this, like, no matter what, you could talk about the same historical event, but the way that it's framed, like, and not to say this in a way that's like, oh, it's an evolutionary process of you start at the imaginary, you start at the symbolic, you start at the real. It's the fact that the interplay of these three registers always allow you to see it from a different angle, until you hit, I guess, for lack of a better term, the parallax of whatever traumatic or symptomal event occurred in your past, or even in a dream. The more you recount, the more that you're able to work through in a different way, especially with the signifier, because it's like you could talk about something and you could have it just a sort of imaginarized thing. It doesn't mean that you have language, like, language is there, you're speaking about it, but there's no punctual moments where signifiers are present, right?
yes.
And so then you recount it again, and then there becomes a scansion of the signifier to be able to recount for that same moment, just in a different lens. And then now that you have signifiers, now you have, a diachronic shift in which now there's a pressurized time of understanding. Wait, I talked about this dream before. Why did my analyst stop me because I said this one word? And so we get a discourse going.
There is a continuity in that sense, but it's not a temporal continuity. It's not the temporal continuity of the imagined lived experience, but there is something lived in the historical dimension of the signifiers that issue during analysis. And we could lead this into the discussion near the end of the lecture, where he's talking about that dictionary. I don't know how to say that one French word, but of certain phrases which we might take to be natural, quote unquote natural, which were coined by someone, like le mot me manque, right? Is one of the examples he has. The word escapes me.
Right. Yeah.
So he's saying that this one French salon, courtier type, like, intellectual coined this phrase, and then it happened to enter into the lexicon of a certain language. It's like almost it enters into the bloodstream of this sort of like vascular system merely by chance. And then other mots, right, MOTS, fall by the wayside for whatever reason. There's no real way to explain it, but it's just a pure contingency of historical eventuality that allows certain phrases to enter into the collectivity. And I don't want to say collective unconscious, because that's going to lead us down the wrong road.
It's so suggested already.
Because there's a subjective dimension to it too, but that's what we're looking for in the session, in analysis, are these signifiers which, like you're saying, Andrew, they repeat themselves. Why the repetition?
Right.
Well, ultimately they're they are in a sense nonsensical. The scene reconstructed via these signifiers does not necessarily predate or pre-exist the present moment within analysis, but it's in some sense constituted. It's a reconstitution of a history which gains a kind of permanence, despite the fact that there is a kind of, it is still an extension of a fantasy. And that's where the fantasy emerges.
Right.
But it's the fantasy that is ultimately has served as the material from which, our lived experience is resourced. And that's we were talking before, I don't want to go too off course, but it just reminded me of something we were talking about, me and Andrew, before the recording started, with efficiency, and how Zizek in Surplus Enjoyment says how, efficient cause, one of Aristotle's four causes, how he thinks that psychoanalysis is an efficient cause of truth, and it's something that modern science does not admit as a possible truth cause, which is the efficient cause. And the efficient cause for Aristotle is the work that goes into the construction of the table, right? The hammering, the nails, the workmanship. Psychoanalysis is an efficient cause of a truth that emerges through the workmanship itself.
But I mean, what I was asking myself in this, like the whole thing you were describing is like this, he's trying to argue that there's a development of new words that enter discourse and so on. And this also relates to the temporal aspect of the symbolic, right? So there's the one thing, like new phrases enter the discourse. And he's kind of saying that there are these kind of ways of saying things that also appear in Schreber's hallucinated voices, right? So there's this aspect of new words. I didn't really get why he thinks that's so important or why he emphasizes this. And then there's the other aspect of that the symbolic has this anticipation and retroaction, right? That's also an aspect of the temporal. And kind of that he's saying it's not this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's rather I don't know, retroactive
infinity loop kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not it's not chronological. So it's not one follows after the other, but it's like one thing happens in the future and it kind of determines the past in some sense. And that's why history is not the past, but it's like the past historicized in the present. So there's these three aspects of time that he emphasizes in the symbolic. And I was like, yeah, that's very interesting, but why is it important for Schreber? You know?
Yeah, that last part of the lecture feels almost, I don't know.
Like, why is it important for Schreber? As in, like, why does that?
How does it reflect? Like, how does it
relate to the?
I think.
Parts?
How does it relate to the first, like, 3 sections of the lecture, right? Because that's the 4th section you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he says kind of, in Schreber's discourse, you can hear that, or not in his discourse, but in the voices he hears, you can recognize certain structural properties, which is these turns of phrase, right? And these sentences that are based on anticipation, but don't end.
Yeah.
And I couldn't gain anything from that other than, well, the symbolic has this temporal aspect. And you can see that the symbolic is outside for Schreber. It's like it's the voices are not nonsense, or the voices are not symbolic, but they have these temporal aspects of the symbolic.
Right. And I would say, like, it's like the sort of, like, because the imaginary has a temporal dimension to it in anticipation, but it's more on a sort of specular frustration, or just a specular dimension. And it is frustrating. And I mean, it's like as if, and it's not like, okay, we have a pure imaginary, we have a pure symbolic. No, it's that the fact that the part of the symbolic that is foreclosed is the signifier, right? Cross signifier, or the S1, the master signifier, which quilts all signification together. And so what we have is like this attempt of temporality, of anticipation, in Schreber's subjectivity, for lack of a better term, and that the only thing is missing is the signifier to make it exactly what our discourse of the unconscious is in psychoanalysis, and how the signifier goes through these movements of time. Because he foreclosed, because the mechanism of psychosis is foreclosure, it rejects symbolic reality and object love, and we just have this investment in secondary narcissism. What we get is just these moments that don't have a quilting, that don't have a punctual end, they don't have retroactivity par excellence. And it's just because that in this fragmentation that are a part of his hallucinations, it's like they're attempting to build a differential network, but they don't have that progression that allow for like the continuity. So it's like the rays are nothing to Schreber in the future because he's having a different hallucination. And yet the analyst can kind of see some kind of continuity, but that's only because the analyst is trying to interpret. But they don't interpret like in the way a neurotic does, right? You know, you can't. You would trigger a psychotic breakdown, but it's as if we see something similar, a sort of pseudo symbolic order as a sort of cope. Because the way I see it is that in the lecture or the essay of Freud, on neurosis, psychosis, and the loss of reality, it's that like, well, the loss of like both the neurotic and psychotic kind of lose a sense of reality and substitute it with something. And I think with the neurotic, it's like via repression, they sort of aim their desire towards like an object love, or for the Lacanian term, it's object cause of desire, objet a. For the neurotic, it's sort of something that substitutes reality based upon their delusion, right? Their narcissism is structured on a delusion and evolves over time. But what's happening with Schreber is that he doesn't have a unary trait in the unconscious, right? Because he doesn't have repression. So everything just happens momentarily, but there's no continuity. There's no metaphor. There's no displacement, right?
I mean,
Right.
So these symptoms don't carry on in different positive inversions or negative inversions.
But I want to also just like address the original question, because I'm rereading parts of the end of this lecture. And what he's saying here is how anyone who would hope to understand the real nature of Schreber's delusion would do well to catalog all of his phrases and try to understand them in their ambiguity, which sounds kind of like an oxymoron. But remember, it's like against understanding. And I think even though it seems like such a detour to bring up all of these different turns of phrases and expressions and their origins and etymologies, but I think what he's saying, well, one, he might be like kind of nesting some of his sort of, finer points with it. Like it's a kind of meta commentary he's making, because he goes from like, he says superstructure at one point, and then he's like, anyone who focuses on superstition is inevitably going to get the superstructure. And you're like, all right, what does that have to do with anything? But anyway, it's kind of like he's cataloging. It's like if you train yourself to think about locutions, phrases, words, their origins, well, one, you will find the most unlikely and confused and convoluted sort of histories attached to different words. But also I guess he's advising that analysts train themselves to listen to the speech, not only of the psychotic, but also the neurotic, in just such a way, almost as if they were historians or philologists of the language, of the speech of their patients. And I think he's also, I guess the next chapter is, it looks like the next chapter is going to really crack this open, because it's like he's saying, you really want to understand Schreber? Remember, the chapter before that was about the imaginary dissolution.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What is the imaginary dialectic that you were talking about earlier, Max, that ultimately is concentrated into this one word, wretch? That one word, once we sort of invert it, we find the entire imaginary dialectic that characterizes Schreber's relationship with God there.
Right.
But then he takes that word now, he's like, but wait, the word is symbolic. What is the symbolic vis-a-vis Schreber's inability to repress, but his remarkable ability to foreclose? What's the symbolic here? This is the symbolic dimension. This is the dimension that's ignored by many analysts and commentators of Schreber's memoirs. Here's a symbolic dimension. But to really understand the symbolic dimension, like this, I feel like this lecture was just him doing some kind of like housekeeping almost of differentiation. Okay, we really need to understand the his verbal hallucinations, the verbal dimension of his hallucinations. And how do we do that? We need to actually become, catalogers of his speech in a way.
Yeah,
So as to not be seduced by the
it's almost going towards like interpretation, right? He's like saying, and I like that what he was saying before, he was saying it's not important if Schreber hears these voices as a real voice or how real these voices seem to him. That's not the important thing. And probably in the end, he's talking about these different phrases and their history to say, it's not important that he has hallucinations, but it's more like, what are these symbolic elements in his hallucinations and what is their histories and so on. Right? Yeah, I get that now. But I really liked what you said, Andrew, because did I understand you correctly that you were saying, well, he has a kind of strange symbolic that's coming from the outside to him, and it is strange because it doesn't have a master signifier.
Yeah.
Doesn't have retroaction. So it is only anticipation.
Right. And this is where it's like, if he were to have the S1, it would mean that you are castrated into language, that you are put into language like in a neurotic structure. But in a psychotic, it always appears as an oncoming intrusive threat. Whereas like for the neurotic, something that is traumatic is very subtle, and it's only recounted retroactively through, the signifiers, the recounting of it. It's something that just seems so like bizarre and mundane, right? Or just ordinary. Nick and I were talking about this prior to the recording about like how, people, whether in analysis or outside of analysis that have never heard of analysis before, just like they want something that is either climactically, impactful in their life when it comes to like truth or meaning or some type of like spirituality that reaches towards some goal. It's always climactic. Or it's just like, if it's not that, then it's utter pure despair and tragedy. Whereas like the traumatic real kind of comes as like a sort of just kind of like a shock effect, but like something that you just didn't expect that was just like right there, like in front of you the whole time that you didn't realize. And like that's the sort of truth effect that psychoanalysis brings. It's like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. Why didn't I think of that before? Like it was like that's like the sort of like effect of the recounting.
Yeah.
Even if when you talk about like an event that we commonsensically would say is traumatic, whether it's like abuse, an overdose from a drug addiction, car accident. But the more that you recount it, the more that it loses sort of that imaginary investment of affectivity and emotional investment. And then you get at the sort of signification, right? And it's not like the fact it's like, well, why do I always like end up in car crashes or something like that? Well, it's not even that, but it's like what is left. And it's just like a coin or something like that. And how the word coin kind of like associates with something that, phonetically rhymes, and then you get into like these other signifiers and it's like somehow that relates. I'm just kind of spinning off the dome, but it's just like the real and the signifier is a sort of residue that's left off.
I think McCormick had this example of the only thing that remains is like the smell of like a burning tire or
Yeah,
something.
burning tire, burning leather, right?
Burning leather,
Yeah,
yeah.
and then like there was an example I heard of that, and it's just like somebody who just like can't stand being around leather, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was
Yeah,
the result. But yeah, I think it's super important what you said, because also in the Freud text we mentioned before, he says explicitly the trauma is not that the thing happened. The
hmm
trauma is when you recount it, kind of.
yes,
And
yes,
it's
yes,
incredible that he says it so directly. And this is like lost on most of people, right?
yeah,
When they think
no,
of Freud or of the term trauma,
hmm
Well,
it's
right, because
the
that's
historicizing. Yeah.
hmm
because it's only when one is somehow, beholden to a set of rules and a linguistic syntax that governs everything around them, that certain events in the past, which were passively received and uninterpreted because there was no need for interpretation, then become suddenly
yeah,
traumatic.
yeah,
And it is in the recounting of it, if not in the session, in terms of like, I like Zizek's example of sort of with Me Too, who's talking
yeah,
about how what Me Too did was force certain women to rethink sexual experiences that they had had, which they might not have considered traumatic at the time. The real trauma is the fact that there is this sort of paradigm shift, and now it's like the entire um the criteria of what is considered sexual assault, rape, abuse changes,
hmm
and then something becomes traumatic in that moment,
right,
which kind of flies in the face of everything that the modern doxa surrounding trauma says, which is,
yeah,
something really terrible that happened to you in the past, and it has 100% informed your life and its character and structure in a way that is completely outside of your control and does have a certain basic continuity to it, as
right.
opposed to, no, in the recounting of it, I am re-experiencing it, reliving it, but also creating it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the
And
whole
it's like
ego.
the trauma, it like usage in like, most behaviorism is just like, oh, the trigger and the fight or flight experience that you have, that resembles the stimulation of the amygdala of like an evolutionary process when we were hunter and gatherers and we had
Lions.
those against
There
the
were lions
lions.
everywhere.
Yeah. And so it's just like that trigger is resembling of a lion, of getting in a car crash or like, going to war, like, or stuff like that. They compare it to that like as some biological thing, or like the Gabor Mate version of it is that trauma is not what happens to you, but it's how you internalize it. You know, that's also his version of it too.
I mean, and it's like,
Guys, I gotta
what?
go soon, but I was just gonna say I have to go soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
But
just wanted to add to what you said, Nick, because that's like the biggest ego thing, which we can relate back to the chronological ego storytelling, right? It's like, oh, my parents, they did this to me, and that's because that's the reason why I'm like this now, right? That's
Yeah.
complete construction of like your ego, and this has this logic of this: first this happened, then this happened, and now I'm like this, right? That's this chronology that he kind of, I think, criticizes, no?
Yeah.
yeah, because it's like, another thing that Slavoj talks about in For They Know Not What They Do is the paradox of how is it that, let's say, this mythical fantasy, although it could correspond to a real incident of witnessing your parents having sex, it's like, how are you, someone who has a knowledge of sex, which is ultimately the knowledge that informs your subjectivity, your sexuation in the world, are entering the perspective of a pre sexuated, let's say, being witnessing this act, this is the kind of chronological ego that you're talking about, which on the one hand has been completely destroyed, wounded, traumatized by what its parents inflicted on it, but at the same time is able to paradoxically, through forms of modern psychotherapy, bear witness to the very moment that traumatized you and robbed you of your innocence in some ways, like to re-enter that frame of
Right.
mind. Do you see, like, it's a paradox, because it's like the thing that, because psychoanalysis would say your trauma is your sexuation, is your subjectivity,
Yeah.
Yeah.
is
Yeah, I
in a
see what
sense
you're
your being in the
saying.
world.
Yeah, totally. I think the only thing we didn't really go that in depth to is like the deja vu thing. And I think that completely relates to this because, okay, if we don't have this temporality of first one thing happens, then another thing happens, and the second thing follows logically from the first thing. It's more the chronology of you are at one point, and then from this point you look back and you in the past create the cause for the point you are at, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I did mention it in the beginning of the talk, but not in the way that you brought it up. I just said like the symbolic order allows for not only for us to have a sense of reality, but to account for something that is unreality, but yet how it's a modulation of the symbolic. Yeah, there's definitely this sort of a point in which we recount for something. And it's, in a sense, something that feels like it happened chronologically in the past, but it may just as well just be artificial, but still has an effect of truth to it, or truth effect that is very synonymous to the recounting of something in psychoanalysis. Yeah.
Like, what do you make of this term or this anecdote about the woman who was at the barricades?
Oh, yeah. You're talking about like the historical thing. It's the fact it's like, all right, I see it like this, and I'm glad you brought it up because I was actually going to mention this in the talk and I might, like, when I introduced the discussion, but I forgot about it. But it's like, this is where it's like, it's not about the historical thing that happened, but in the way that it talks that this barricades thing has significance. And it's like, this is a niche example, some little US history for you. So the person, David E. Farragut, is a naval admiral of the Civil War who helped lead, during the Civil War on the north side, and he was also responsible for leading us to the Battle of the Mobile Bay, in which the tides had turned, in which the South, started to lose, and the North win, and won, and then therefore, the Confederate States lost, and we became the United States. But he had this saying called, I think during like the heated moment, where he said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." And so I see this signifier of "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead" as a sort of signifier that recounts for a moment of who David E. Farragut was in this climactic war, and not about his life, who he was, where he went to school, how he got into the Navy and became an admiral, but that sort of monumental moment doesn't even, like, people could hear that in the Navy and not even know the history of David E. Farragut and even remember the war, but just the fact that "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead" accounts for the fact that we won the war, and we became not only a glorious unified Navy, but a United States, right? And the funny thing is that some naval officer in the academy wrote an article on this, saying that there's actually no account for the fact that he really said the statement, that this is just a recounting from peers that worked with him in the Navy and were his like military colleagues that coined this phrase. So it's not even a true statement from him. Like, who knows if he actually said that? But I see this as that, in which like something could stand in for like a historical event, for that, not even the chronology, but something of the significance of it.
It's like, that's why he talks about like a decisive moment of symbolic articulation. It's like a point instead of a whole line of whatever.
And so we should think of the time in psychoanalysis not as chronology or chronos, but of kairos, of a punctual right time moment. you know.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
we talked about this with World War I and the start of it with what's his name, the
Gavrilo Princip,
Princip, yeah, you know.
right, who assassinated Franz Ferdinand. But you know, I was also thinking of how it's kind of like the anti-climax of interpretation when it does arrive, because
Mhm.
in analysis, a good psychoanalyst is going to be extremely chary of interpretation, meaning they're not going to be as generous as you would hope. But when interpretation does come, it's inevitably disappointing. It's inevitably anticlimactic, and it is inevitably trivializing almost of what you might have thought of as like a kind of heroic
Mhm.
experience. And it just makes me think of how I almost lost the train of thought there. I don't know what that says about
Uh-huh.
my own signifying system, but of shit, what was I get? What were you just talking about, Andrew? I just had a
About
point.
the damn the torpedoes full speed ahead as like this sort of
Oh, okay,
monumental
yeah. So
phrase.
like of how the thing that might have been weighing on you the most was just something you heard at a
Mhm.
young age
Right.
at a
Right.
inopportune moment, or the fact that, like, I remember Freud, I don't know when he talks about this, but he talks about how he does he like pee the bed or something, and then his father says he'll either be a great man or a terrible man or something like that.
What was that? I
Yeah,
remember the first part. Yeah.
he'll either be a great man or a terrible man, and it's like, okay, because he he peed the bed or so, it's always just the most
Yeah.
banal, common, everyday, episodic experience that
Right.
just has certain words tacked onto it that in
Mhm.
some ways, like, oh, now this word is forever inscribed in my psyche.
Yeah.
It's like emblazoned there, and now it motivates how I do things. Then someone later says, you're not great at all, you're terrible. So, and then these signifiers come back up, and it's like but
Right.
it's stupid. It's nonsensical ultimately. It's like so
Yeah.
banal and silly.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, now because we were talking about the temporality, I'm even thinking that the childhood aspect of it isn't even that important,
Mm-mm.
right? People always, they are like, oh, I don't know, psychoanalysis, it's all about something happened in your childhood and this that then determines you from then on, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, in this chapter, he's kind of arguing that it's not the case.
No,
Because
I don't know.
it's not important what happened chronologically to whatever the woman's name is, but it's important that she was there, and this retroactively gives some kind of historical importance, right?
Mhm.
Because he says what interests us are the decisive moments of symbolic articulation of history, but in the sense in which we say the history of France.
Mhm.
I also wanted to say, like, it's you had such a great example, Andrew, because it fits so perfectly in like the tradition of Lacan to be a hipster with
Mhm.
examples, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if your example is well known in America, but
Well, I mean, yeah, like
Oh,
if he's
damn
the Civil
torpedoes,
War,
yeah.
but like in naval history, he's like iconic. So
but that also fits perfectly to what he
yeah,
says about like these turns of phrase that like remain as some kind of fragments. But
right.
I wanted to say, so about this deja vu, right? It's like, so I had a boring example in my head about it, and I tried to fit it into this temporality. So imagine like you meet a woman and it gives you some kind of deja vu, right? Is it because, and then you ask yourself, why do you have this deja vu? And somehow you uh, have this retroactive quilting of it, and you're like, yeah, this woman has the same symbolic meaning as my mother, or something like that. Is it that? Or, and how does this aspect of unreality fit into it? I'm basically saying I didn't get the deja vu part at all, and I still don't understand it. Like he's talking about anticipation and retroaction, and then deja vu. I'm like,
well, I
whoa.
think what he's trying to get at is he's trying to use it, the deja vu as an example, but he doesn't want us to get lost in deja vu and psychologize it, because he's like saying that psychoanalysis is dealing with the inverse of that. You know, we're not trying to account for like a memory like we felt like we had, but that we get like this sort of artificial memory that comes about in this chance moment, right? That only can really happen because of the modulation of the symbolic order, rather than like trying to see the nature of deja vu in some type of like psychology of the mind type thing. It's just like, oh, like, you know, because of the nature of the signifier, you know, we could see deja vu like this, and this is like very similar to what psychoanalysis does, but we're not dealing with like, oh, this memory is just like this. Like, you know, we're dealing with the sort of truth effect. That's how I saw it.
So do you think it's like this?
Like the truth effect has like an unreality, like, you know,
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, but is the deja vu an aspect of retroactivity, or is it caused by retroactivity?
I would say that there is a retroactivity because you're trying to recount for like a memory, but it isn't retroactivity in and of itself, but that the deja vu allows you to recount for a memory that happened based upon an artificial moment, you know. And even that memory that you have, because you're comparing it to the deja vu, may be artificial in itself.
Well, like the memory might not be
They're real at
anything
all.
in particular, but it's more like these. I took it as the symbolic structure itself suddenly becomes present, is made present, and that's sort of like you're experiencing the symbolic structure itself, kind of like coming to the surface, but it's not doesn't correspond to any literal experience that's you that you've gone through. Yeah.
Okay, I see it. It's like you notice the structuring aspect of the symbolic in that moment.
I thought of I thought of another example of, have you ever not been able to recall the exact person you're thinking of, or a movie or a song, but the qualities of it kind of are with you? Like suddenly you're like, oh, I know, it's kind of, I feel this way about this person, or I feel this way about this song. Does that make sense? It's like the properties of that thing are present. And
like
then there's a delay. Like, oh, right, okay.
But you're not sure.
Yeah. Or like you felt like you
Yeah, it's kind of cool because you're like, yeah, the
like
whole web of
you confuse
associations is like suddenly present to you.
Yeah, like, or like you like reminisce
The
about
what?
it with the memory of like, you know, like, oh, like I went to this. Remember when we went to the sick party, and you're like, I never went there with you, and like you're like, oh, maybe it was with a different person, but I could have sworn it was with you. You know, like you confuse, you know, that event with that person with someone else.
Right.
But I love that example that you give, Nick, because it is kind of the symbolic itself shows up in a very pure form, because it's without meaning. Like you only have the potential stuff around it, but not the meaning, like the signification.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then later on,
I gotta
yeah, we should probably quote it right
but
here.
I think we got it. No, we went through everything.
We went through
think
everything.
so. No, what were we gonna say though? Just to cap it off.
Even more.
Just to quilt it.
Well, I mean, I would just say
Max is gonna say something though. I didn't want to. We didn't want to cut
read
him off.
a sentence. I can read it.
Yeah, go. A symbolic sentence.
Deja vu is a phenomenon extremely close to what analytic experience offers to us as the déjà raconté. Yeah, they're already recounted.
Yeah.
So as an analysis, as an analysis in déjà vu, the symbolic becomes apparent.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Well, I'm experiencing it right now. I feel like we've all been here before.
Well, we've
Doing
recorded
just-
how many times now?
We are psychotic, so we don't have the quilting.
No,
All
that
right, so we will end it here, but we won't quilt it here.
yeah, we won't quilt it.
We
Yeah.
won't quilt it. It's not quilted.
Yeah.
It's free
Lud-
floating.
I'll just say this, Ludar.
Luda.
Oh no, we have to say yeah, Luda is the quilting point. But if we want to leave it off with like a sentence that's pure anticipation without quilting, we can give the Schreber sentence, which is lacking now is
Is end.